Our speaker is Lin Lowe. She has been in Florida for 26 years and has been a gardener for almost 50 years, has grown orchids for almost 15 of those years. She has a master's degree in education from USF and is an accredited judge of the American Orchid Society. She has also been a past member of the Species Identification Task Force of the American Orchid Society. Lin, welcome to our program.
As Michael said, I am a accredited American Orchid Society judge. I also was a member of the Species Identification Task Force. Neither of those things make me an expert on Florida orchids. I started getting interested in Florida orchids about, I guess, 3 or 4 years ago. I was still actively judging at that time. And I really found some wonderful resources, and I wanted to share them with you all because you may want to delve into this a little bit further than what I can get into tonight. The book that you see there, hopefully you see it on the right, The Native Orchids of Florida, that was written by Dr. Carl Leur. And Dr. Leur, if you don't know, and you may, he was a surgeon in Sarasota, and he happened to be Marie Selby's doctor. And I think if it were not for Dr. Leur, we would have Selby Rose Garden, because Marie Selby grew roses, and she and her late husband had planned to leave their estate to the city of Sarasota as a rose garden. But Dr. Leur was able to convince her that an orchid research facility, and it is a wonderful botanical garden, would be of more use to the state of Florida. And I think that it is. They get about 175,000 visitors a year. I don't think last year they did, but in a normal time they would have. Dr. Leur became fascinated with orchids when he saw the ghost orchid, and he left his surgical practice early, and it became kind of his mission to travel the state of Florida with his wife and his 2 sons, and they spent a lot of time trying to find and also finding orchids that had never been cataloged before. He is a very prolific botanist. He is responsible for describing and naming over 3,000 species of orchids. And these are not Florida orchids. There are not that many in Florida, but he became a specialist in the pleurophthalid alliance, which is mostly in the Central America and the northern part of South America. He also donated 3,000 herbarium, his specimens, to Selby before he died, which was in November of 2019. The other book that I would totally recommend to you is this book by Paul Martin Brown. It is Wild Orchids of Florida. It has been published several times. Dr. Leur's book that I just spoke about was published in 1973. So we're talking, 50 years ago almost. This book is a little bit more recent. I believe the most recent printing is 2005. Paul Martin Brown was and I believe he still is, a research associate with the University of Florida. And he is the editor of the North American Native Orchid Journal, which you can find online in PDF format, and it's free. The book covers 118 species of orchids. I believe that we have about 120, but notice I'm saying about because it does fluctuate. But basically, this is a great book. It has some very good keys in it. It is dedicated to Dr. Leur, and Dr. Leur also wrote the foreword in the book. In addition to these 2 books, the Florida Plant Atlas is invaluable as far as cataloging and providing pictures. A lot of the pictures that you're going to see tonight came from there. That, and of course, there's lots of other internet sources on orchids. I would stay away from Facebook, but that's just my opinion. So I want to start with kind of a definition about what we mean by native. Orchids are the largest flowering plant family behind the Asteraceae. There are about 35,000 species of orchids in the world. And even here in Florida, we have terrestrials, we have epiphytes, meaning that they grow on trees, we have lianas, and we have even mycotrophic orchids. They have been around for very many years. We don't have any orchid fossils. What we do have is a bee fossil, and the bee is carrying orchid pollen. And that fossil is dated to about 20 million years ago, which is about the same time that the seas receded to the point of our coastline in Florida being what it is today. So by native, what I'm trying to get at is it grows here and naturally. And first, I want to start with a few non-examples. These are what you would call invasives. This is a nasty little guy, Zeuxine strateumatica. You may have seen this. It's a very low growing orchid, probably 3 to 4 inches tall. They make a white mat, and they will grow in full sun right in your lawn. If I see them, which I do, I pull them out and throw them away. This is another one, Eulophia graminea. After Hurricane Irma, I got a delivery of mulch from the city of St. Pete, a big, free, and it was loaded with these. I didn't know what they were at first, and I thought, well, that looks a lot like an orchid, and sure enough, as soon as it flowered, I could figure out what it was. But these, I'm still, I guess it's been almost 4 years, I'm still occasionally finding these in the mulch. These are, usually you see these at big box stores, and they're labeled ground orchid sometimes. They're very adaptable. They're very easy to grow. And they are sometimes pollinated by our native bees. The picture in the middle is Phaius tankervilleae, and that happened to be the first orchid to flower in England in 1778. And it will actually root from the stem nodes. So that's pretty unusual for an orchid, but these are not natives. These are not what I'm talking about here tonight. Some of them sound like they're native. Bletia florida, and it's a pretty picture, and you can see there the map from the Florida Plant Atlas. It was found in that part of our state, so that's around Miami-Dade, right? It's really an escapee from Trinidad and Tobago. It was discovered in 1813, and Brown, he thinks that it was an escapee from some of the orchid growers down in Homestead, Florida. But these are not our focus tonight. I'm just trying to narrow it down a little bit. I do not know how some of these things like Zeuxine strateumatica get here, except that there's a lot of shipping between the part of the world you see in the triangle and us here. And that is where they are native to. So I don't think anyone has the answer to that. It's just kind of a guess. So what makes an orchid? If you're out in the woods and you see a flower you've never seen before, if it was me, I'd be thinking, wow, is it an orchid? So if you carefully look at it without disturbing it, this is what I want you to kind of come away with tonight. It is not the lip of the flower. I know that that most people go to orchid shows and they see big flowery cattleyas with splashy lips. But there's a whole family of plants called the Lamiaceae, which is the mint family, and they are united by the fact that they have lips. So you cannot determine that the flower is an orchid from looking at the lip. This picture is here just kind of to jog your memory. This is a Phalaenopsis hybrid that was made, I guess it's probably been 20 years ago now. And it was hybridized to eliminate the lip and make it look more like a petal. The lip kind of evolved as an attractor to pollinators in the first place. So it's not the lip that makes it an orchid. It is, in fact, the reproductive parts of the flower. So the flower you see on the left, which is maybe a hibiscus, it's some stylized flower, but fairly typical of a non-orchid flower. At the very top will be the stigma. It usually has a sticky liquid on the top of it in order to capture the pollen, which is given off from the anthers. And once that happens, then the seed is formed within the ovule, and that's the way reproduction takes place in a normal flower. But in an orchid, everything is contained within the column. And the picture on the right, which is a cymbidium, you can see there's no stigma that you can see, just this thing sticking up with a cap on it. And that's an anther cap. And as we're going to see in the next slide, it'll hopefully make a little bit more sense. The picture on the left is the column of the orchid, and the cap has been removed. Underneath the anther cap is the pollinia, and the pollinia needs to contact the stigma in order for the orchid to be fertilized and seed to be produced. But orchids are designed to not be self-pollinating. And so ideally what happens is a bee flies by, because orchids are, for the most part, at least the ones that aren't red, which is most of them, they're designed to have a bee come to pollinate. So the bee comes by, runs into the anther cap looking for pollen. It usually attaches itself to the bee, and then he flies to another flower where hopefully a bee has been before him, that anther cap has been knocked off, and the pollinia goes into the stigma there. It's a rather convoluted way of doing things, but it doesn't always work that way in Florida. I wanted to start with Spiranthes because this is the largest genus of orchids in Florida. It is also, to me at least, one of the most confusing genus because they all look alike. And these are not things that you see at orchid shows. And I maybe should have explained that a little bit more, but some of the things we're going to see tonight, you will see at orchid shows, but very many of them, like the ones that here at the beginning of the presentation, they cannot be moved. They cannot be grown in a greenhouse very well. So these are basically plants that you will encounter, if you're lucky, in the wild. The reason that they are so difficult to identify is that the arrangement of the flowers, if you look at what I hope is the lower left on your screen, Spiranthes laciniata, you see a beautiful spiral going around the stem, but you could encounter that same plant 5 minutes later and the flowers will all be on one side of the stem. So it is very difficult to identify this. You really need to know the time of year that a certain species is going to flower. And according to Brown, there is a Spiranthes in flower every month of the year in Florida, which is pretty amazing. We do have an endemic, meaning that it only grows here in Florida, and that is the picture in the center. That is Spiranthes sylvatica. On the side, both sides, you see Spiranthes praecox, which is our most widespread and common Spiranthes here. And sylvatica used to be considered Spiranthes praecox. You notice, if you will, the pictures of praecox, you've got a totally different flower arrangement on the picture on the left as you do the picture on the right. So again, very, very tough to identify. But Brown separated out of Spiranthes praecox. He named it Spiranthes sylvatica based on the fact that the flowers are larger and the flowers are found in the woodlands, whereas praecox is found in prairies and meadows. They're both green and green veined flowers, and other than size, they look very similar. He described this plant in 2001, so you can see this is fairly recently that he has done this work. This is a beautiful wildflower that looks like you would expect an orchid to look in the wild. And the pictures that you see in the middle of the map shows places where this has been found growing in the past and maybe in the present. This, I wish I could tell you for sure that it was still there, but I can't. I'm not terribly hopeful about this. Cleistesiopsis oricamporum. It has another Cleistesiopsis divaricata. They were both members of the genus Govenia and have been separated out. The genus Govenia still has plants in it. It still exists, but Cleistesiopsis is the new genus. And divaricata is found mostly in the panhandle near where pitcher plants grow. If you've ever been up there, you can see them along the side of the road sometimes, and often you'll find divaricata growing there too. There is an endemic natural hybrid between these two species called ochlockneensis. I'm afraid I have no picture of it. I could not find one. But as you can kind of put it together in your mind, it will look very much like a cross between these two. You have the dorsal sepal at the top, which is curled. The laterals are on both sides, and then the petals are folded over. In 1957, in the Everglades National Park, the director of the Everglades National Park's name is Dr. Frank Craighead at that time, and he found this Govenia, which he thought was Govenia utriculata, which is a fairly common Govenia in Central America and South America, Northern South America. But in 2000, Brown did a lot of work on it and compared the two and decided that this was in fact a separate species. So this is our endemic, it grows nowhere else, Govenia floridana, and it's quite a beautiful flower. If it is still around, it would flower in November and December in the Everglades, I'm sure, maybe even in the Fakahatchee. This is very recently done by Brown, and you'll notice different names here. Eulophia pottsii, Orthochylis cristatus. It's also another synonym is Orthochylis pottsii. And this has been accepted by Q as Eulophia pottsii, but the three pictures here, the one on the left, this is the plicate leaf that you will also, that very often in a terrestrial orchid, this is the type of leaf you will see. The veins are vertical. The picture in the center, if you can see it, there's a very tall peduncle on that. This is the name, the giant orchid. This is one of its common names. And then a close-up of the flowers on the right. I want to show you, and as we go along, I think it'll make more sense, but these flowers don't open very widely at all, which would make it difficult for a pollinator, a bee, to get in here and do what they need to do. We have 4 or 5 endemic Platanthera hybrids. I only have a picture of the one in the center. The genus Platanthera is, it consists of about 40 North American and Eurasian species. It is one of the major segregates from Habenaria, Habenaria being the largest orchid genus in the US and Canada. It is the second largest orchid genus in Florida. The picture on the left is Platanthera Phaius. It is one of the parents of the picture you see in the center, Platanthera X bicolor. And then on the right, Platanthera ciliaris, I'm sure named for the fringy hairs on the lip. That's the other parent. And so whenever you see a name of an orchid and there's an X in front of the species name, that is denoting that it is considered a natural hybrid. Habenaria quinquecetta. We have 4 species of Habenaria in Florida. These are, I know, still around because I've seen these walking in the woods before. They are mostly moth pollinated and very hard to distinguish one species from another, very difficult. We have 5 species of Trifora in Florida. This is 4 of them. The picture on the left that is showing no flower is Trifora rickettii. This was described by Carl Leur, and many botanists, when he first described it, thought it was the same thing as Eulophia, which is the 3rd picture over with the little flowers. But it seems that they have accepted the fact that it is 2 separate species, and rickettii is considered a Florida endemic. Trifora are really unusual. I would love to see this. I've never seen one in the wild or anywhere else. They are ephemeral. You can see that they're kind of strange. And the next slide here, Trifora craighedii. This is also a Trifora that Dr. Leur found and named. It took him 3 years of going back to the same spot to try and find this orchid in flower. Someone told him that they thought there was a stand of them in Brooksville. They tend to grow in groups because they're only open. This is just amazing to me. They open at night and they're closed by noon the next day. So any pollination that has to take place takes place then. And they're only open from the last week of June to the first couple days of July. So very ephemeral, very tiny, but to me, very special orchids. There's also been specimens of this found in Highlands County and Collier County also. And then the mycotrophic orchids are orchids that have no chlorophyll. As you can see, there's no green on these plants. They live from the mycorrhizal fungi from a host plant. They're not really parasites, but they could not be disturbed. They could not be moved because they are there because whatever, oftentimes it's a tree. The tree is producing the mycorrhizal fungi and they are tuned into that specific location. I remember seeing some of these when I was a kid, and I wasn't here in Florida. They grow in on the East Coast, not only in Florida, but they're very cool. Most people are interested in the vanillas. We had, I'm not sure we still do, 5 different species of vanilla that have grown here in Florida. Planifolia, the second one listed, is the one that is used to produce the vanilla bean. And if you've ever purchased vanilla, you know that it's fairly expensive. Most of the vanilla comes from Madagascar now, even though planifolia is very plentiful in Mexico. The tricky thing about vanilla, the flowers are fairly elusive, and planifolia must be hand pollinated to get the seed to set, which explains a lot about the cost. Barbellata is a species that's been found in the Everglades. It has kind of a two-step reproductive process. There is a fly that comes down and bites the seed pod. Something in that fly's bite causes the liquid in the seed pod to ferment. Then a second type of fly that's after the fermented liquid finds that, and in the course of drinking the fermented liquid, it picks up the seed and goes hopefully on to the next vanilla vine. These are considered lianas because of the thickness of the vine, and they will grow unbelievably huge. I have seen them take over an 8x10 greenhouse, literally from top to bottom. Now, I don't know that maybe in the Fakahatchee you would find vanilla, but I'm not sure there's much of it around, maybe in the Everglades too. This is Bulbophyllum urstidii. Bulbophyllum is it's a very big plant genus that is, its main attraction is flies, and it usually gives off a really foul scent, I would say in probably 97% of the species. A lot of times the flowers are meant to imitate rotting meat. This was found by Fred Fuchs. If you're familiar with RF Orchids down in Homestead, Fred Fuchs was his father and quite an orchid hunter. And he found this bulbophyllum in the Fakahatchee strand and tried everything he could to keep the location secret from the orchid hunters, because there are plenty. And one day he went back to check on it and it was gone. So I would say, and I'm not the only one, it is probably now extinct in Florida. It is, however, fairly widespread in Central America. Tolumnia bahamensis, you can probably tell from the name, it's from the Bahamas originally. In 1905, as some plants were found in West Palm Beach of this orchid, Tolumnia bahamensis. It is considered a twig epiphyte, which is kind of an unusual classification. A twig epiphyte, it starts its life growing on the ground, but then it works its way up into the branches of a tree. And then finally, when it flowers, the flower spikes come up over the top branches of the shrub. It's usually a shrub, not a tree. It is listed as endangered by the Florida Plant Atlas. I don't know. There's so much development at that part of our state that I would be really surprised if it still exists. The picture on the right, these are all flowers of Tolumnia bahamensis, and just to show you how variable the flowers can be from one plant to another. This is our native orchid. This is our orchid, Tampensis, named for Tampa. The Encyclia tampensis was found in Tampa in 1846, which is a real long time ago. It is also probably found in Cuba and in the Bahamas. It is the most abundant epiphytic orchid in Florida, and it's a lovely epiphyte. The form that you see on the left there, which is the alba form, this is a ward photo. This is called alba labia. That is the form that the botanist Eric Christensen gave it that name. The picture on the right is more of a typical form, although as you will see here, these are all tampenses. So it's really hard to say which is a typical form. Some of these are award photos. Some of them are from the Florida Plant Atlas. Usually Encyclia tampensis is dependent on a bee pollinator, and it puts out its scent, which is a honey scent, in the afternoon, like maybe 3 o'clock. However, there have been a number of plants found in the southern part of the state that don't smell at all the same way the ones up here do. They have more of a chocolate scent. And there is a theory, and I don't think there's any way to prove it, that Encyclia tampensis started as a hybrid swarm between Encyclia phoenicia, which has that chocolate scent, and Encyclia plicata. Neither of those two species of orchids grow in Florida anymore. This is kind of an explanation of what makes it so variable. There's great use for Encyclia tampensis for orchid hybridizers because as an epiphyte, it imparts cold tolerance to the hybrids, and so it's been used quite a bit to make hybrids.
Excuse me, Lynn, before you move forward, can we go back to the Encyclia tampensis and just say a word or two about the Million Orchid Project at Fairchild Botanical Garden, because people may be interested in knowing that they can purchase these plants and propagate them in their own landscape.
Well, I know that there is, and I can't remember what city it was, that bought a lot of little baby tampensis. And now when I say baby, I'm talking 3 or 4 inches across, not what you're referring to, Rebecca, but I will address that too. And they tied them in trees all around the city. It will live in almost any type of tree, even a smooth bark tree like a palm. And they did it to beautify the city. And I'm sure it made it smell really good in the afternoons. Rebecca was saying to me earlier before the presentation started, I was not aware too much about the Million Orchid Project for Fairchild, but I do know they were raising a lot of Encyclia tampensis. I thought they were selling plants. I did not realize they were selling flasks. I have to say that if you don't have a greenhouse, buying a flask is not a good investment. Usually
can you define flask? Because I didn't see that term at all in the literature that was delivered with the plants.
What did it say?
Well, I mean, these are little bare root plants that have a developed root, and the leaves are about 3 inches long and 1/4 of an inch wide. And they come in flats in, like starter soil. And we were able to purchase, I think 6 of them were about $40, and an entire flat of 32 plants was $200. So a
Okay.
number of us on the board went in together, and they don't ship them. You would have to be in Miami to pick them up. And I happened to be in Miami, so I brought back 3 flats of these teeny tiny little orchids with instructions that came to attach them to trees, which one of our members did, and came out the next day and 4 of them were gone. So she's thinking that the squirrels got them, but you know, these are available to purchase. And like I say, the instructions that they provided was just to take the bare root plant and using twine attach it to a tree. So, but I don't know what a flask is. I assume that's FLASK.
Yes, that's what I thought you were talking about before instead of flats. It sounds like what you bought was something from a compote, which would be the next step after flask. I without seeing the plant, it's kind of tough for me to say. But let me try and imagine what you've got. Ideally, it would go into a greenhouse at least for a while. But assuming that that's not an option, the best thing to do would be to tie it to a tree with, I would use a cable tie. You can also try and purchase a piece of tree fern, which is not always readily available, but sometimes even Home Depot has them. You can attach it to a piece of tree fern with a cable tie. And then every day it needs water. It doesn't need to sit in water. It shouldn't sit in water, but its roots need to be moistened every day. As far as squirrels getting it, I don't have any remedy to suggest for that. I know that I used to have a greenhouse before I moved over here to St. Pete, and I brought a few orchids with me that were left after I sold or gave away my orchids, and the squirrels got most of them. I guess that's what got most of them. You know, I'd find them on the ground. So I would say attach them with plastic, excuse me, and water them daily and keep them out of the sun.
All right, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
And I will post the link to the Million Orchid Project in the chat for anybody that's interested.
So I think we were here. This is another orchid that is, it grows not only in Florida, but it's particularly Mexico. This is Prostechia cochleata, and this is a orchid that is non-resuppinant. Non-resuppinant means that the lip, which is the purple part you see on the right-hand photo, is at the top of the plant. There is the Mexican form, and then there is the Florida form. And the Florida form, which is considered our endemic, is different because it has 3 anther caps. So if you look at the picture on the left, and I apologize, I know it's a little blurry, those 3 orange nodules there are the anther caps. So that's what's covering the pollinia. And in Florida, this is something that, this is not the only orchid that has made an adaptation like this. I think you'll see that this is called the subspecies triandrus because it has the 3 anther caps. It is a little bit smaller than the Mexican variety. It's a little, the flowers are smaller, the plants are smaller. The color is usually a little less vibrant. Sometimes you see these at orchid shows, entered as Florida natives, which they are. But the only way you really can tell is by looking at the anther cap. This is another Prostachia. This is Boothiana, and this is a spectacular plant. This was greenhouse grown. The plant looks huge, but it was about, I would say maybe 7 by 7, just a little plant. The flowers are teeny tiny. And according to Dr. Leur, this was once a very common orchid in Florida, particularly in the southern part of the state, in the Keys and in Dade County. But by the time the book was written, which you figure is 50 years ago, this was already becoming pretty rare. It tended to grow on the trunks of buttonwood trees rather than at the top of the trees. So it was readily accessible to people that wanted to collect orchids, and, you know, pull it from the tree and it is gone. What it has in common with Prostachia cochleata that we just saw is it also has the triandrous form. The difference, if you look at the picture on the right, is there is no anther cap at all here. So this is a mutation that Callaway Dotson, who is a very famous botanist, orchid botanist, I guess is his specialty. It is his conjecture that this is a mutation that came about as an adaptation to a lack of pollinators here in Florida. So we see this there are several orchids that have this same triandrous situation. This is another epiphytic orchid, Epidendrum canopsium. Some people call this Epidendrum magnoliae. This is the only epiphytic orchid found north of Florida. It is usually not found any further south than Tampa, and it can grow all the way into Texas and northeastern Mexico. They usually grow high up in the trees in clumps near resurrection ferns, but they're very difficult to see because they are so tiny. And I know it's hard to tell from this photo because, again, this is a greenhouse grown orchid, and I think there are 900 flowers on this. Definitely not typical of what you would see in the wild. The name Canopsium means gnat. So that's what the flowers were considered, about the size of a gnat. This is Epidendrum floridens, which sounds like a Florida native, but is not. This is also found in Cuba. It was described by Eric Hagsater in 1993. Carl Leur thought that because every plant he found, the flowers were so uniform, he thought it was all the result of one escapee or introduction, but I have not found any corroborating evidence on this, so I'm just putting it out there as a theory. This one is not self-pollinating. It is likely pollinated by a moth at night. I think this is probably true for all flowers, but generally very light yellow or white orchids are normally, they've adapted to being pollinated at night by moths. Epidendrum nocturnum. This is a large and really unforgettable plant. The flower that you see on the left is pretty much life size. They get to be about 6 inches across. The flowers come out one at a time. And they stay in flower for many months because of that. So if you were to see one of these, you would probably see a faded flower, and next to it or above it, you would see a flower that is just coming out. It is found, it's pretty widespread. It's likely still around in the, possibly in the Fakahatchee, possibly in the Everglades. It is Found also in Mexico and Central America, going all the way down into Brazil. So it's a fairly widespread plant. I don't think there are many of them in Florida, but there could be plenty in the Everglades that I just don't know about. It is listed as endangered, and if we have it, it's going to be in the southern part of our state. Epidendrum rigidum is found often growing where you see Epidendrum nocturnum that we just saw. This is a very small orchid, tiny flowers. 50 years ago, when Carl Leur wrote that book, this was considered our most common epiphytic orchid. He wrote this in the book. He said, colonies of plants can engulf branches of trees and are rather commonplace. Not so anymore. This is listed as endangered, and again, a very small orchid would be difficult to see in the wild. If you remember back to the beginning of the presentation, I showed you a Bletia that I said was a non-native. This is a native, Bletia purpurea. We have 3 species, and 2 of them are non-natives. This is our native orchid, not endemic because it is widespread. In Guatemala, you can see these along the side of the road. It's plicate leaves with the vertical veining like we talked about before. The flower spikes are held up very nicely above the flower. It makes a beautiful plant. And this does not have a rostellum, so very likely this is also a self-pollinating orchid. It's also very well adapted. As I said, you see it in road cuts. It's also can even be found growing in swampy areas just above the water line, and it can be growing in pine forests where it's dry. So it's a very adaptable orchid. I guess this is my personal favorite. You do see these at orchid shows. This is Strateumatica punctatum. And it's not obvious from this picture, but this is a huge, these plants get absolutely huge. You can see the picture with the man's hand holding the seed pods. The seed pods take over a year to mature. It has a common name of the cowhorn orchid or the cigar orchid. You can see the sheathing on the pseudobulbs down there. I'm sure that's why it gets its name. Here's a close-up of 2 of the flowers, and you can see that they're very different. This is an orchid that covers probably the widest range of any that I've covered tonight. This goes all the way down into the northern parts of Argentina, and the flowers flower obviously at a different time of year, but they also look a little bit different. They are all going for a pollinator, however. It's not an endemic orchid, of course. It's found, as I said, going all the way down into Argentina. Here in Florida, it flowers from March until about now. You could still find them in flower here. It is an easy orchid to grow. It will take full sun, unlike most orchids. And as I said, you see them a fair amount at orchid shows. They can be either terrestrial or they can be epiphytic. This is 2 pictures from our quarterly magazine, the Palmetto. This is from an article that Roger Hammer wrote a few years ago. And it's Strateumatica punctatum, which often grows, it can grow as a terrestrial, but it likes to grow up on like a fence post, which I believe is what it's sitting. Oh no, this is a buttonwood stump that it's sitting on here, the picture on the left. There was, he recounted in his article, I believe it was in the 1920s or so, a picture of a horse-drawn carriage carrying a huge specimen of this plant. It had 201 pseudobulbs, and it was being hauled to a rich person's house that lived on Biscayne Bay. So they do get huge. They have been way over collected. I have the article here. I wanted to read you all what he wrote. He had found this orchid when he was in his early 40s. He said, remember, this was 1988. So now fast forward to 2017, because during those 29 years, I made annual pilgrimages to visit my newfound friend each spring during flowering season to pay homage. And with each passing year, it was even more spectacular than the year before. I checked on it shortly after Hurricane Andrew in 1992, and also after Hurricanes Katrina and Wilma in 2005, and it survived all of those storms. But then came Hurricane Irma in early September 2017. So that is the picture that you see on the right. And by the time he was able to get in there, and they closed the park, of course, because of the hurricane and the flooding, but by the time he was able to get in there, it was November, and the plant had been toppled off of the stump that it was growing on and had fallen into the water and was pretty much dead. It was obvious that he was upset about this, but he did say that he saw more punctatums growing nearby. So they are still around. They're very hardy, but it was a great article. It was great to read. Stratopodium punctatum is like about a third of all orchids. Remember, there's about 35,000 species of orchids. Well, about a third of them, so let's call it 10,000. 10,000 of these orchids throughout the world rely on deception to trick bees into coming to visit them. You see these poor dumb bees over there on the right. The Euglossa hemichlora is the one on top. Most people call it a euglossine bee, and then Centris aerens is underneath it. And these are the main orchid pollinating bees. I thought at one time, I'm not sure, but when I was in Brandon, I'm pretty sure I saw a euglossine bee, but basically they're South American and island bees for the most part. So those three flowers you see there, the flower in the middle is not an orchid. That is a flower from the family Malpighiaceae called stigmaphyllon, also known as Amazon vine. It gives a rich nectar reward to the bees that come to visit it. Stratopodium punctatum, the flowers you see on either side, has evolved to trick the bees into thinking that they're running into a familiar vine that's going to give them a reward. And they adapted by growing these, I don't know if you can see it in the picture, these little knobs that called keels growing on the flower that is meant to act like the stigma of the Amazon vine, and it guides the bee to where the flower wants it to go to pick up the anther and pick up the pollinia. And this is not the only Florida native that does this. We also have, notice the yellow color too. This is the bee's favorite color. Oncidium floridanum and Oncidium insatum, they're now one and the same. One is a synonym. Floridanum is a synonym now of insatum. The picture in the center is a locust berry, which is not an orchid, and it is a flower that gives a very another pollen-heavy, rich nectar flower. So these flowers, these species of orchids, have evolved to trick the bees into thinking that they also have a nectar reward, when in fact they do not. Dendrophilus perectus, the leafless orchid. This is probably still fairly plentiful because it's hard to see. It tends to grow at the tops of trees. The common name for this is the jingle bell orchid. I think because the flowers, I'm not sure why they look like jingle bells to somebody, but this is what its common name is. This is a frost-resistant orchid, and it's widely adaptable. At one time, it was found from Gainesville south and into Cuba, the Yucatan Peninsula. It may still be that plentiful. I know that there are people that grow these for the novelty of it. And then I want to close with the other leafless orchid that you all may be familiar with. This is the famous ghost orchid of books and movies, Dendrophylax lindenii. This is an award photo that the flowers are quite spectacular. They're about 3 inches across. This does have a nectary. It does give a reward to the pollinators. It's thought to be pollinated by the hawk moth. And this is the orchid that kind of bit Carl Leur and gave him the orchid bug. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you all very much. Can I, are there any questions? Let me see if I can figure out how to get into the chat from here. Okay.
I don't see any questions in the chat. Let me scroll.
I don't see any either.
I think there was, oh, somebody asked, what was the name of the periodical that you mentioned, the one that's available online?
Online, it's the North American Native Orchid Journal, and it is in PDF format. It has wonderful information in it, but it's difficult to search. So if you are looking for a particular orchid, it might come up, you know, if you Google it, it might come up. And it has some great information.
All right. So I have a question. If I wanted to plan a field trip where we could go out and possibly see some native orchids, where should we go? That's the first question. Second question is, if we are just out walking in a conservation area, where should we be looking? How do we train ourselves as to where to look for orchids?
That's a harder question. The first question that you had, I would say the Fakahatchee strand, which is down around the Big Cypress.
Yes.
That's probably the best place to go. I'm hoping to go there in November or December. A lot of times what you're going to deal with when you're looking for orchids is standing water.
Okay.
I myself, I know I'm a sissy about some things. I do not like standing water. And so I'm hoping November, December, I will see some flowering orchids and I will not have to deal with standing water. The other place would be just in the Great Cypress in general, but I would say that Fakahatchee Preserve is probably the #1 location. Now, if you go up to into the Panhandle, where the pitcher plants grow all along 98, you're liable to see some orchids there, but you're along the roadway. And so that would be less likely. Most of the time, I know that the begonia types will grow close to water, but most of the time they're not going to be in the water, but kind of over the water so that the humidity from the water is readily available to them. I hope that answers it. I really don't have a good answer for your second question.
Lynn, we also have questions relating to vanilla. The 2 questions are, one person was interested in whether or not they could grow it themselves for food. And another one of our members is asking, they understood that Phaius is investigating vanilla as a possible Florida crop. Can you answer either of those questions?
Yeah, everybody has an interest in vanilla, and it is the only orchid that produces a crop. I think it is being investigated, but I do not know the details of that. I do know that it's not frost tolerant, so it would have to be either in a greenhouse or in the part of the state where you would get no possibility of frost. And the pollination, like I said, is usually done by hand, and that is extremely labor intensive. It's the actual seed pod that produces the vanilla beans. So if you can get a vanilla, the seed pod itself, you can put that in a small bottle with a liquor around it, like a vodka, and over about 3 months' time, you'll have vanilla. And you just keep topping it off whenever you use it, and you can, keep it going that way. Did I answer your question, Michael?
I think you did. Do you know anything, though, about whether University of Florida is doing anything specific on it?
I do not know. I know that they usually are looking to help the farmers so they're always looking for crops, hybrid strawberries, things like that. I wouldn't be a bit surprised, but I don't know anything about that, I'm afraid.
Okay. Let's see. One of our members did mention there are videos on YouTube that show you how to fertilize flowers to produce beans. Anybody else have a question? I think that's it, Lynn.
Well, great.
I want to give you my personal thanks for speaking tonight, and would probably mirror the fact that many of the other members also have been very pleased with your presentation.
Well, I'm glad to do it. I'm very glad to do it.
Well, if no one else has any further questions for the speaker.
I do see one other question that came up, and somebody's saying, can you help me buy native orchids? Lynn, do you know of a source for purchasing native orchids other than Fairchild Botanical Garden in Miami?
Yeah, I would definitely go local. I would not go to Miami. I'm kind of out of the orchid business now. There was a St. Pete orchid farm. I do not know if it's still around. I used to be a member of a lot of orchid societies. And if you, whoever asked that question, find that you're really interested in orchids, my advice would be to look up, there's Florida West Coast Orchid Society, which meets at Florida Botanical Garden. I think it's the second Thursday of the month. They usually have an orchid vendor there. They're extremely knowledgeable. There's several orchid places in Tampa, but they're not so much about native orchids. They're more, cattleyas and the things that you see at orchid shows. But I would recommend Florida West Coast Orchid Society if you want to pursue growing native orchids. They usually have temperate there for sale almost every month. Or if you went and they didn't have it, you could certainly find out and get it there.
All right, I just posted the link to their website in the chat session. So anybody interested can click on that link, and that'll tell them more about the Orchid Society.
Super.
All right, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lynn. And if no further questions, that is the end of our meeting for this month, and we will see you again on the first Wednesday of next month. Bye-bye.
Bye.